Okay, so nationalism can act as both a centripetal and a centrifugal force. We're going to look at two locations where nationalism played out in very different ways, where centripetal forces and centrifugal forces were both at play, and it led to very different outcomes. So the first one, the first situation, the first case we're going to look at is Switzerland. And it is, of course, right here in the middle of Europe. And Switzerland has been a place. There has been an identity, a territory called Switzerland for a really long time. And they date it to at least 1291. And there's a lot of pieces of that identity. They are incredibly famous for their neutrality, for example. They stayed out of World War II. They refused to enter into the war. That's one of the things that Switzerland is the most known for. They only joined the UN in 2002. So there's this idea of standing apart and being neutral that's been around for a really long time. At the same time, there's also a huge amount of diversity. Even though there's this long-standing identity, the two biggest aspects of culture, language and religion, are very diverse in Switzerland. So here is the distribution of languages in Switzerland, for example. And the language you speak, that's a big piece of nationalism, of how you think of yourself as who you are and how others are different. And so we've got German, French, Italian, and Romansh. And then we have areas that are bilingual. There's no one language that dominates. Okay? So we've got a huge amount of diversity in terms of language. We also have a huge amount of diversity here in terms of religion, another big piece of the way people think of themselves. And look how intermixed it is and how complex the pattern of religion is here. We've got Catholics. We've got areas where neither Catholics nor Protestants are in the majority. We have areas that have a majority of Protestantism. And there are areas that are more Protestant or areas that are more Catholic. So there's a lot of religious complexity on top of that linguistic diversity. But then at the same time we have all of that complexity, we have that national identity that is Switzerland. Told you, they've been around since at least 1291. They've had a constitution since then. There it is, with these fabulous seals on it. They call themselves one of the world's oldest democracies, for example. Take a lot of pride in that. There's that outdoorsiness, the skiing, that is so much a part of the Swiss identity. There's things like the cuckoo clocks that they're famous for and their efficiency, the Swiss Army knife, which is an important symbol and still made there. There's things like the Swiss banks, right? And numbered accounts that are not labeled with someone's name, so you can put money or things in vaults that you want to hide. And they're very famous for that as well. We can get into the ethical questions of that another time, but all of these things are a piece of what makes Switzerland Switzerland. That people think of these things when they think of Switzerland. These are things that Swiss people take pride in. So despite the fact that there are centrifugal forces, that centripetal force of common identity, of shared beliefs and ideas, those two are at odds, right? They are in counterbalance to each other. So the things that would make Switzerland fall apart and split that identity are religion and language. The things that pull it together are all of those pieces of national identity that I just had on that last slide. So despite the fact that there are differences, that common identity pulls them together, and Switzerland has existed for, hundreds of years. They are able to overcome the fall apart, the centrifugal forces. So that's something where nationalism is uniting. But what happens if, in the balance, nationalism is a dividing force? If we look at the former Yugoslavia, for example, we have a very different situation. This is a place that was formed after World War I, out of a whole bunch of different places. Parts of it had been the Ottoman Empire, parts of it had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and this was a place where people were very divided in many ways. Yugoslavia was kind of a loose confederation of a bunch of different groups who wanted their own territory, but it was tied together by a really charismatic leader. And so it hung together for a while. There was this uniting force that held them together. But look at what it looks like now. Right? We went from this big unit here, to that, to all of these different independent countries now. And they don't all get along still, right? And there's a lot of controversy about Kosovo and some of these other places. But this thing that was the former Yugoslavia splintered. Why did that happen? Because of nationalism. So here, and that splintering is called balkanization. I'll define that more in just a minute. Look at the complexity here of identities. This is a map of the major ethnic majorities. This isn't even the minorities. This is just the majorities here. Look at all of these different groups that are here. So some of them, it's pretty easy to divide out. But look at all of this going on in Bosnia and Herzegovina, down here along with where Kosovo is, right? All of these different groups living right next to each other, each wanting their own territory. And a huge amount of these ethnicities is tied to language. And they each have their own language, right? And they're similar, but they're different. And they view other people who speak other languages with suspicion. An awful lot of these different identities is also tied to religion. Okay? The green areas are where Muslims are. Here we have Muslims, we have Eastern Orthodox people, and we have Catholic people. And these conflicts literally go back hundreds of years. Okay? We are talking here about territories where the land was acquired by the Ottoman Empire in the 1300s and 1400s. So we're talking a minimum of 600 years ago that the conflicts that people still have very much in their minds is still causing problems. Because what happened is the Ottoman Empire, which was based down here in, it was Constantinople, but then it became Istanbul. Right? They spread to the west and to the north, and they took over this territory. And in that time, there were people who had been Eastern Orthodox who were tied to the Byzantine Empire, which was then conquered by the Ottoman Empire. There were people who had converted to Catholicism, and those two groups did not get along well. So there had been tension there. And now suddenly there were people who were converting to Islam because of the new people who were in charge in this area, or Muslims were moving into the area. So these three religious groups started fighting then, and they haven't stopped since. And unfortunately, that continues to be a huge schism, a huge split. So that is another piece of the centrifugal force. Okay, so these forces have been so splintering, in fact, and so conflicted and so complex that it led to the Kosovo War in the 1990s. The centrifugal forces drove things until things exploded like a powder keg. And that word I used a few minutes ago, balkanization, that means literally to split apart, for a country or a region to fragment and break into pieces, which is exactly what the former Yugoslavia did. And it's called balkanization because of this region, because of all of that diversity, because of the long-standing patterns here of people fighting and having conflict. This area is called the Balkans, and so balkanization is to be politically conflicted and fragmented because of this region. And the centrifugal forces became so bad that we had the Kosovo War. There were thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. There are mass graves. Landmines continue to litter this area. There was a genocide against the Bosnians, right? Slobodan Milosevic, who was the leader in Serbia, was charged with crimes against humanity because of their actions. the Serbs were trying to clear out the Bosnians and take their land. They claimed that their identity, that their sense of nationalism, meant that they should have the land that the Bosnians also said was theirs. So in this case, nationalism and these separate identities tied to language and tied to religion drove things apart. Okay? So the language and religion, those separate identities, were so strong that there was nothing pulling together, and there was no charismatic leader anymore. There was no central sense of identity to try to unify. And so what ended up happening here was things fell apart, and we ended up with all of those different countries instead of the former Yugoslavia. Okay. So that is where I'm going to leave things for the moment. Okay. Go ahead and do the readings, and then watch the video. This is David Reynolds, who is presenting the documentary, and some of the places that he's going to be talking about are those areas that we just discussed in the former Yugoslavia, in the Balkans. Okay? All right, I'll talk to you guys soon. Let me know what questions you have, and I hope you enjoyed the readings and the documentary this week.